Welcome to Board Governance, Risk and Opportunities in a Complex World, 1 year later. My name is Lizanne Eisen, and I am an acting professor of the practice at Cornell Law School and Cornell Tech. I'm also the faculty director for the Cornell Tech Board Forum. Today, we've got a great group of people who are thoughtful around AI and technology and geopolitical opportunities and challenges facing board members. In July 2023, we discussed these topics, and today, given the explosive growth of AI and its prominent feature in headlines across the news, we're here to update the views that these panelists gave us in July of 2023. As we did before, we'll focus on the perspective of senior business leaders and the opportunities and challenges they might be focused on. This hour-long session can barely scratch the surface and is a precursor to our upcoming Cornell Tech Board Forum in early 2025. Details are available on eCornell. In addition, a link to the prior program is also available in the chat. I will introduce our panelists and then we'll jump in. Dr. Irving Waldowski-Berger is a recognized thought leader in AI. He is currently a research fellow at MIT and Stanford after retiring from a 37-year career at IBM. Bill Priestap was the former head of counterintelligence at the FBI and now leads Trenchcoat Advisors, bringing his expertise to the private sector. Noah Phillips is a former FTC commissioner and now a partner at the law firm of Cravath, Swaine & Moore, LLP. Dave Kappos was the former head of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office and is now a partner at Cravath, leading the IP practice there. He is also an adjunct professor at Cornell, and I have the pleasure of teaching with him. I want to make a note that we'll take questions throughout the program, so please put them in the chat. And with that introduction, let's get started. Irving, could I ask you, as you did last time, would you describe your thoughts on the impact of AI on jobs and how, if at all, your thinking about that has changed since the last time we had the opportunity to talk?
Well, first of all, Lizanne, it's a pleasure to be here with you and my fellow panelists again. So I went back and looked at what I said at our last meeting on July 13 of last year. And I said at the time that a key question in my mind is whether AI would likely follow the same evolution as other historically transformative technologies like electricity, computers, and most recently the internet, or whether AI is in a class by itself because it deals with, or at least gets confused as dealing with, human intelligence, which none of the others did. And I said at the time that I concluded that AI should be treated by company senior executives and board members like other major technologies, such as the internet. When dealing with AI projects, they should focus on how to best leverage AI for business value. So now you should ask me, Irving, what is that business value of AI? And let me go back to an analogy of something I'm very familiar with. What is the essence of the business value, or what was, of the internet? And I think there were three things. And when I was at IBM, leading the internet division, we really thought very hard about it. And there were three key business things: communications, email and stuff like that, the ability to reach many, many people; content, the World Wide Web; and then a ton of applications like e-commerce or Zoom that we are using right now. So what is the equivalent business value of AI? And people have been writing quite a bit about it in the last year. And the answer is AI is all about data. That's the essence of the business value. You can say, wait a second, I thought it was human intelligence. No, no, no. That's the science fiction movies. And that is all kinds of interesting articles you can write. But it turns out, not surprisingly, that for business, data is incredibly important. And in fact, this has been analyzed by some very good people. And I went back and looked at an article of Tom Davenport, who's somebody who I really respect, has been looking at that. And he wrote, collecting data, transforming it, and putting it to use is essential to remain competitive today. More and more companies are naming chief data officers. I would say that the way I think about this, the first 50 years of IT, let's say from the 1960s to the 2000, were mostly about software and hardware architecture. And then over the last 20 years, 25 years, it's been all about data. That's what big data and data science have been. That's what machine learning, that's what Gen AI, that's what they all are. And that's the essence of AI. Now, companies haven't spent before a lot of time worrying about how to leverage and make money from all their data. Now they have no choice but to do that. And that is one of the biggest things going on here.
So, Irving, let me ask you, what in light of this transformation and thinking about the changes, what do you think senior leaders should be thinking about in terms of skills for their workforce?
Well, they need to, given what I said, that the appearance of data in business and how to leverage for business value is relatively recent. You say, well, it's been going on for 20 years. Well, yeah, 20 years started with analytics and big data and so on, but the big time using it, whether it is deep learning or Gen AI now, that's 10 years old at most, which is very, very recent. So they need to make sure that their employees know what's going on, that they start thinking, how much data do I have that I can put to work to do better decisions, to do better analysis, to do better research? And you could say, well, weren't they always doing that before? No, because we didn't have that much data before. We had it in some fields. If you ask a high energy physicist at CERN in Geneva, do you know about data? They would say, what do you mean? That's all we do. If you ask a radio astronomer looking for extragalactic planets, do they know about data? They say yes. Or people looking at genomics, but in the more quote unquote world outside of the research world, we didn't have all that data. That only started because of the internet, the digital economy, all of the little smartphones we carry around. They've been generating gazillions of data. I think I looked up recently, it's like 150 times 10 to the 21 is what people, and I don't even know how to pronounce the 10 to the 21 kind of data, and it keeps increasing. So what businesses need to do is try to make sure that their workers are educated in how to leverage data for business value.
Thanks, Irving. That's great advice. You've mentioned science fiction movies now, and I know you talked about that last time as well. You said last time that you did not see AI posing an existential threat to humanity. Has your thinking on this evolved at all?
No, not at all. If you want me to discuss an existential threat, right now, cybersecurity, totally different subject. And I was just in another meeting before on cybersecurity. That is a real immediate threat. I don't need to tell anybody here how much that's happening. But, I think that if somebody said, well, could it be an existential threat over the next 10 years? I would say, I don't see that at all. We can barely make money from it in business, let alone looking at an existential threat. And you could say to me, well, what about 50 years? And at that point, let me go back and tell you what a very top researcher at MIT, Rodney Brooks, who is a top roboticist and a emeritus professor, said at a keynote he gave at the MIT CIO Symposium in May about what he called Hollywood scenarios. And what he said is many AI researchers and pundits ignore the fact that if we are able to eventually build super intelligent systems, the world will have changed significantly by then. We will not be suddenly surprised by the existence of such super intelligence because, it has been building up over time. It's not like War of the Worlds where you wake up one day and the Martians arrived and we say, what do we do now? So when things change more gradually, we adjust to it and we keep making changes so that by the time, if ever we should worry about AI as an existential threat, we will have developed the proper mechanisms, controls, and regulations to ameliorate those threats. That's what I think humanity has always done, and that's my expectation. So in the near future, I absolutely don't see that. In the long-term future, maybe we need to worry more, but if we have 30, 40, 50 years to learn how to do that, that's pretty good.
Thanks, Irving. You mentioned cybersecurity, which leads me to Bill Priestap, who I know knows a lot about cybersecurity and the risks that it presents. Bill, do you want to comment on anything that Irving said?
No, and no comments on what Irving said. I thought he said it very well, very well.
Great. And in the last keynote you participated in, you described the global risk environment. If anything, it seems like it's gotten worse since the last time we were all together in July of 2023. Is there anything you'd like to highlight?
Sure. So I unfortunately, I do think it has gotten worse, and I could point to a number of events around the world. I mean, just to name a few, from the Russia-Ukraine war to Israel and hostilities with Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthi rebels in Yemen and Iran. That situation, of course, does not seem to be going in the right direction. On top of that, China and its territorial disputes and with a variety of its neighbors in the South and East China Seas, that only seems to be worsening. I can't keep track anymore of the extreme weather events, which are affecting global security in a number of ways. And these are just a few of the events that unfortunately don't seem to be improving. But I would say, I guess, if I wanted to highlight just one thing that really concerns me is what I'm seeing as the strengthening relationships between the US's big four adversaries, namely China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And I could provide a variety of examples, but if you just take the case of Russia's war with Ukraine, what is China doing, among other things? Well, it's providing a variety of weapons components to Russia for use in its war. What's Iran doing? Among a variety of other things, it is providing drones and most recently ballistic missiles to Russia to be used. What is North Korea doing? It is providing just a boatload of munitions for Russia to use. And the things I named, those are the things we know about publicly, which is generally the tip of the iceberg as far as what's going on in totality. And so, in what other ways are these countries collaborating today in a manner that would be detrimental to the United States? But that it concerns me greatly. Of course, on top of all that, 3 of the 4 countries I named have nuclear weapons. The only one that doesn't is Iran, and yet they've been trying to develop them. And from what I understand, are getting closer and closer to having them. If you combine the population of those 4 countries, it's only 5 times the population of the US. And so again, from a US security standpoint, I think that burgeoning relationship between those countries is extremely troubling.
And now, given that we're here talking about AI, do you see AI impacting the risk environment and the things that you just talked about? How is it showing up?
No, I do. And back to Irving's comments, I do think threat actors are still developing it further. So it's not like it's being used to its maximum extent by any means. But right off the bat, when Irving is talking about what is the core essence of AI, it's data. Well, there is an AI arms race, not just between countries, but of course threat actors and companies trying to do the right thing. But so on top of that, if data is so valuable, that means an awful lot of threat actors are going to be interested in stealing it. They're going to be interested in sabotaging it. They're going to be interested in influencing the way it's utilized. So that means for anybody who possesses valuable data, your risk profile is going to increase because a number of threat actors are going to be targeting it. But unfortunately, it doesn't stop there. Heard a lot about how AI is being used on the battlefield today, especially in between Russia and Ukraine, of course. But it's also enabling threat actors that just think of hackers who, through the use of AI, they're able to do more things. For example, identify more vulnerabilities in computer systems. They're able to identify those vulnerabilities more quickly. And then when they execute attacks, with the help of AI, their attacks can be more effective. So in effect, it's putting some of the weaponry on steroids as far as its the volume, the speed, the effectiveness of those weapons. And then last but not least, I believe it's enabling larger and more effective disinformation campaigns. And at least with what I read publicly, we're certainly seeing this being used by nation states. But I'm convinced it's only a matter of time before there's going to be more of a bleed over in the corporate sector. So you can imagine, let's say I'm a company and I'm competing against yours, but I'm unscrupulous and we're competing and I'm learning I can't keep up with you. What might I do? I'm going to look for ways to drag you down, to muddy you up. And I'm convinced we're going to see more disinformation campaigns either targeted against a certain company's executives, a certain company's products, or a company's culture writ large. And again, the whole idea is to make you look bad so I can find a way to outcompete you. But these are just a few of the examples. I think, well, and Irving alluded to it too. There's an AI arms race. There's an AI arms race for good, but there's also an AI arms race for, unfortunately, for bad purposes as well.
So in light of this, Bill, what do you think boards should be thinking about, and folks in the C-suite and chief information security officers? What should they be thinking about, and really how is your view on this evolving with this AI arms race?
Yeah, so in some ways, I think I'm repeating myself from last time, at least with this first thought. But it's the idea that if I'm a board member today, I think it's just critical to acknowledge the risk environment is bad. So last time we talked, it was bad. It's now worse, and whatever it's worth, my perspective, it's still going to get worse. From everything I read, see, the people I talk to, it continues to deteriorate. So the first thing is I need to acknowledge that. On top of that, I have to accept the fact that the U.S. government is stretched thin. I named just a couple of the conflicts, the issues they're dealing with, but there's a lot more of those, and it can barely keep up with those world events. At the end of the day, it can't protect all the things that need protecting, meaning our need protecting in our country. For example, our companies. So I've got to get over the idea that somebody else is going to provide the protection I need. I guess what I'm trying to communicate is things are bad, they're going to get worse, and acknowledge the fact that my organization, we're on our own. A few of us were talking before we came on screen, and the question came up about companies always asking themselves, how can I be more profitable today? And of course, it's an extremely relevant question. But on top of that, if I'm a board member, I hope they'll also be asking, how can I better protect my vital assets today? What people do I need? What tools do I need? What plans and processes do I need? Nobody should be surprised if the companies are experiencing bad events going forward. And so what do I have in place anticipating that something bad could happen so that I can recover as quickly and as effectively as possible?
Thanks, Bill. With respect to regulation, no, I'm going to turn to you and focus again on the arms race that Bill talked about, the AI arms race. In the last, first I'll ask if you have any comments, and then I'll jump in and ask you sort of where we are on the regulatory front.
Sure. Thanks, Lizanne. And it's great to be back with all of you. Really appreciate the opportunity to participate here. I think as far as comments on what Irving said and what Bill said, what you heard was, your data can be used for good. It can be used for business purposes. It can be used also for ill. And there may be actors, whether they're state actors or competing companies, that want to use those data against your firm. What the regulators are often focused on is not so much the ill that is going to be visited upon you, but maybe the ill that you might visit upon others. And I mean specifically, we hear a lot of words coming out of the agencies about the capacity of AI to turbocharge fraud, right? To make fraud actors much more effective in what they're doing. We also hear a lot from the agencies about the need to sort of get at the people who are behind the tools for committing illegality. They're interested in going upstream. So just as they're interested in the more prosaic call centers, they're also interested in folks who are designing, marketing AI for use in things like fraud. Another clear area for this is, where you have data, that those data can be shared and they can be used. And if you look, for example, at the DOJ's complaint against RealPage about how property owners are deciding how to price their rental units, and how they're effectively trading information through RealPage, or at least that's what the government alleges. It's an example of how these data can be used in ways that concern the government. So I think you should be worried about what can happen to you, but you should also be very mindful of what you've got, what you're designing, and how those tools are being used downstream.
And in terms of regulatory posture, you've mentioned some recent actions. I think they fall into two buckets, right? There's competition and consumer protection. Anything more you want to say about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we were here last year, one of the things I said is that when the government sees something new, and especially when they see something new and maybe concerning, the first thing they look to is the tools in front of them, right? We can have a conversation about legislation, and we did last year with Steve Israel, but Congress is slower to move and often is not decisive about what precisely it wants to do. But in theory, at least, the agencies already have their marching orders. And I do think not only are we seeing rhetoric from them, we are seeing some action. So, for example, on the consumer protection side, when the FTC brought the case that it did against Amazon and Ring about how they stored, how they protected data, and also used data to train algorithms, AI was a theme in that enforcement, and a theme the agency since is touting. We've seen press reports that the Department of Justice is looking at NVIDIA, that the Federal Trade Commission is looking at Microsoft's investment in and deal with OpenAI. And what those reflect is the agencies see innovation, they see a growth in the market, and they are worried that the failure of the government to intervene and intervene early will allow for the agglomeration of undue levels of power, what they believe they also saw, almost a generation ago in the context of social media. So they're beginning investigations, and they're going to try to develop cases where they see harms.
So in light of that, and without a clear legislative roadmap necessarily, given Congress is slow to act, what should board members be thinking about as they're coming into year end and heading into 2025?
Yeah. So on the consumer protection side, I'll just elaborate on the point I made earlier. It's very important to understand, if you're involved in the development or the marketing of AI technology, what your technology is being used for by the people to whom you're selling it. Because if it's being used for nefarious purposes, you may also have liability, and that could be a big problem for you. On the competition side, the government is always very naturally attracted to companies that have sort of a prominent place in the market. They're looking for choke points, like there's one company that's making all the chips, or one company that's making all the machines that make the chips, or one company that's selling all the chips that everybody wants for their data centers, and so forth. Understanding the relationships you have with those companies can also be a relevant consideration on the competition side. To be clear, the most important thing is to make sure that the people who are working for you, your management, and the workers that are working for them are trained in basic legal principles, because oftentimes enforcement finds what we sort of later realize are just very, very stupid decisions that people make just in a new context because they're so excited they're not paying attention. So basic, training on antitrust principles, on consumer protection, and also being mindful, who are your counterparties and what is your technology being used to do?
Great, thanks, Noah. We'll come back. I think we'll have some questions about that, but we'll come back to it after Dave has a chance to weigh in on everything that's been said. Thanks, Dave, for joining us. I want to give you an opportunity to comment on anything that Irving, Bill, or Noah has said thus far before we jump in.
Sure. Thanks, Lizanne. And great to be back, and great to see friends from this panel, and hope to have a good opportunity to be helpful to the Cornell board community as well. And thanks for convening us, Lizanne. I feel a little bit like the situation you face as the last guy to talk, where everything that should be said and needs to be said has been said. It's just that not everybody has yet said it. So I'll try and avoid that trap, but I will comment a bit on what's been said already. So first of all, Irving, I couldn't agree more with the comment that AI is a tool, using slightly my own words there. In my world, the legal world, and particularly the innovation part of the legal world, we're observing now, after a lot of fear about AI becoming the Uber inventor, that AI is not making inventions. It's a powerful tool. In the biotech area, genomics area, other fields, it's dramatically improving the ability to sort drug candidates, to understand potential side effects, to sort for efficacy, to avoid toxicity issues or understand them in order to avoid them. It's a bit like a super duper microscope. The microscope was a powerful tool when it was invented, and AI is a super powerful tool, but it's not making inventions, right? So I couldn't agree more on the fact that we don't need to be anywhere near as afraid of AI as we need to be managing its potential to do good and to help humanity grow, make better decisions, et cetera, et cetera. I'll also agree with Irving. AI really is all about the data. We've had the algorithms that make AI work more or less for a long time, modulo or X of the ability to more precisely adjust weights that we've gotten better at as a technical and even a legal and business community in recent years. What we didn't have was the giant and ubiquitous access to data. So data definitely is where the action is. But here I'll mention, one other thing. Of course, there are legal implications, and I think Bill nicely addressed the fact that, as the bank robbers sometimes say, why do I rob banks? Because that's where the money is. Why do people go after data, and why are cyber intrusions occurring at greater frequency? Well, because that's where the value is, right? The data. So there definitely is an issue there. I'll come back to that in just a second. But there's an odd, and I hope Irving can come back to this next point, there's an odd issue that's occurring with data. We're actually running out of it. The world's data is now mostly accessible to AI, and the AI engines are running out of human-generated data. As a result, we've seen in the last, I think, year or so, the introduction of so-called synthetic data has become quite prominent. But of course, with every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And we've seen that with the advent of synthetic data, there are also some issues that are coming up. The ones that come to mind for me are overfitting, which occurs where the synthetic data is too tightly bound. And so it causes the AI engine to get really good at a more narrow range of activities. The example is, an AI engine trained with pictures of white cats because they're synthetically generated from an original white cat, will get really good at identifying white cats, but it'll be way worse at identifying other kinds of cats. So then synthetic data, the overfitting problem is an issue. There's another issue from synthetic data, and that goes to an issue, a problem called model collapse, where with the introduction of synthetic data, the model can simply stop working. The reason I bring those up is to say that in my mind, they raise a new issue for us with respect to data, which is the importance of more human-generated data, because synthetic data, while it can be useful, it cannot solve all of our problems, and it creates new problems. So I would argue that one of the trends we need to focus on in the era of AI is the need for more human-generated data that's accessible to AI engines. And therefore, we need to focus, redouble our efforts to focus on the incentives, the intellectual property incentives that cause humans to generate data, whether it's works of art, music, or the kinds of data from scientific research that Irving was talking about. So some really interesting issues that come up in the data area not just the cyber intrusion part of it, not just that the action is about data, but the need for more data, particularly more human-generated. So, Liz, just one or two other very quick comments now, and then I'll stop. We can have a discussion. To Bill's point about cyber intrusions in my world, where my day job is doing deals of all kinds, giant M&A deals, strategic alliances, intellectual property related agreements. It used to be like 3 to 5 years ago, once in a while, we'd see a cyber intrusion incident around a deal. Now it's nearly every deal. We've gotten used to nearly every deal we do in diligence, we learn about a cyber intrusion incident. So my practical comment on that is that companies need to have a plan to prepare for cyber intrusion. So you're not just trying to figure out what to do, who to call, where to get help in real time. You already know what to do. And companies that have had a cyber intrusion need to take the follow-up very, very seriously, because you will get asked about it, not only by NOAA's regulators, who, as NOAA already explained, are happy to heap blame on the victim by holding it accountable for not doing the right things following up after the cyber intrusion. So you've got an adding insult to injury problem there. If your company suffers an intrusion, not only will you have to deal with the threat actors, you'll have to deal with the regulators who are going to come after you afterwards. So having a handle on being prepared and dealing with a cyber intrusion, very seriously, have become the orders of the day. Last point, going to NOAA's thought, yes, agree that regulators are focused on things like cyber and AI and the possible negative implications. But here I'd like to turn it a bit and come back to the positives and say that in the work I'm doing with boards, right, I'm spending a lot of time trying to help boards not only manage and oversee and ask the right questions about the risks and the downsides, but also manage and oversee and ask the right questions about the opportunities. Because it's now become the case where every company I deal with, whether it's a software company or a mining and minerals company, is asking about AI, they're using AI, they're trying to understand how to get better with AI. And we, whether it's the lawyers or the technologists or whatever, need to be helping boards ask the growth questions in addition to the risk management questions.
Thanks, Steve. Irving, you've been very patient waiting since all of your co-panelists have spoken. So I'll turn back to you to see if you have any comments on what Dave, Noah, and Bill had to say. And then we've got some questions.
No, I mean, I totally agree on what they said and the fact that we need to be much more vigilant on how all this data is used because of the impact, and this has been true of the internet and other technologies and other tools. It's part of the geospatial competition between, let's say, the US and China primarily to make sure that we have the right research, we attract the right people. It gets to a point that we're not discussing here. Well, Irving, you just read an article in the Times that said that all these really sharp Chinese students who are getting degrees here are trying to stay here, to work here, and we're not giving them visas. Does that make sense to you? And I would say, no, we want the best. I mean, this country is all about attracting the best and brightest. So do everything you can to keep them here because we want their research. Let me just make a point that's been in my mind more recently when it comes to AI models. And there are two kinds of AI models. The deep learning models, which are get a lot of data about a specific subject, whether it is playing chess, you have lots of chess moves through history, you analyze them and the algorithm makes a decision, playing championship level Go, healthcare, research, and so on. But then all the attention in the last, I would say, 3-4 years has been on Gen AI, which is the ability to quote unquote understand natural language. And that is all trained by scraping the internet and doing all kinds of things, training the models. But, one of the nice things about a new subject is you say, gee, let me do a little bit of reading about what linguists and cognitive scientists have to say, and can you use language for reasoning? And to a person, they all say, no, 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 Irving, language's role is communication. I'm using it now to talk to you. But there is a difference between communications and meaning, and you and I understanding each other. And when you and I are understanding each other, and I'm going to use words that I just learned recently, my brain is communicating with your brain, and I'm using the natural language as the vehicle to communicate. But the fact that you and I and everybody else here can understand each other is not because of the natural language, it's because we share a common view of the world, and we do a lot in common. The reason I'm saying that is we may be running out of data to train large language models to understand text and speech and so on. We are absolutely not running out of data to do medical research, to do financial research. Dave Kapos, I'm sure you will agree that lawyers generate lots and lots and lots of data. I don't think we're running out of legal data that then can be analyzed to look for patterns in legal arguments. And so it's very important to make a distinction between the large language models that we're all excited about because, they can do Shakespearean sonnets and all kinds of things that I have no idea how you make money out of. And then the more deep data that is domain specific, whose value will keep going up, and we will not run out of that data because that's data that's generated by doing healthcare, medical things, and legal things and financial things. So we have a lot to learn still, and let's not be distracted by the shiny thing of what ChatGPT can do.
Thanks, Irving. I want to jump in. We've danced around a lot the importance of data. Let's call it a strategic asset, and open it up to the group to think about how do boards and C-suite individuals identify what is actually a strategic asset in their data and can be monetized as opposed to other data that may not be. Maybe Dave, I'll ask you first if you have any thoughts on that, and then open it up to Bill and Noah and Irving.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Lizanne. So step one, boards need to coach and work with their companies that they're overseeing to take an inventory of their data, understand then what data they have and what rights they have in it. Do they own that data? Do they have license rights to that data? have they made promises regarding that data not to use it in certain ways or only to use it in other ways? Is that data otherwise subject to overriding legal regimes, like personally identifiable data now typically is subject to, extremely strong overriding legal regimes such as the GDPR in Europe, the CPRA in California, and a large and growing number of other state data privacy laws in the US. So getting a handle on the data and getting a, spreadsheet type inventory of it together with the rights that your company has in it is absolutely step number one. And if you embark on starting to use data without finishing that step number one, you're likely to end up in a compromised legal position.
Thanks, Dave. That's a perfect segue. I'll open it up, Bill, Irving, Noah, if you want to say anything, but we have a regulatory question for Noah next. So any further comments on data as a strategic asset?
I would just add one quick thing, and because over the last few years especially, I've dealt with a variety of companies, and one of the first questions I ask them is, what are their vital assets? And I have been surprised by the number of companies who've told me, well, we've never really identified or defined what that is. Like somebody I was speaking to recently said, you talk to 10 different people here, you'll get 10 different answers. Just from a protection, because I think we all agree this data is really valuable and it can be even more valuable for certain companies. I just think it's critically important as an organization, just as and David explained how, but to in effect identify and prioritize the vital assets so that you can then employ your protection resources accordingly. But this idea of, well, I'm going to protect everything. I just think that's a fallacy. You can't protect everything well. And so it is really critical to identify that data that is most valuable to you, and then again, employ the resources you need to protect it.
Thanks, Bill. I'll turn now to the concept of regulatory regimes. Dave, you mentioned GDPR, and Noah, I'll start with you. There is a perception that perhaps other regulators are more advanced in their regulation and consideration of AI, and we're starting to see a patchwork of regimes applicable to AI, data privacy, and competition analysis, particularly out of the EU. What do you think? And is perception reality from your perspective?
Thanks, Lizanne. The short answer to the question is that we definitely do see a multiplicity of regimes. That's both like across nations, right? Us versus the EC or the UK or China or what have you, and also within the US, right? Because we're a federal system and we have both regulation at the federal level and at the state level. On AI specifically, right, Europe has a bill, right? The EU has a bill that is law today. In the US, we don't have a generalized AI regulation of any kind, but California has two bills sitting on Gavin Newsom, the governor's desk, ready for his signature. Whether he will do that, I don't know. But these bills mandate, things like transparency and risk assessment and mitigation about some of these, kind of high-level risks that a lot of people associate with AI. The takeaway, I think, from the data privacy space is likely to apply here, and that is no one should wait on us to have a global and organized approach to regulating new technology. That may develop over a very long period of time. But I think where we are right now, which is companies having to deal with a patchwork of regulation, is very likely to be where we remain for a long period of time. As to who's winning, and what's more advanced, I think that's more of a value judgment, and it's obviously based on an assessment of what the right regulatory scheme is. But we don't really need to worry about that question. The point is, what are the laws on the books today? And there we do see the development of a bunch of different approaches to how to regulate, broadly speaking, AI.
Great. Thank you. Dave, Irving, Bill, anything you want to add?
Let me just add a point when we talked about how data is a critical asset. Remember, data is only critical asset in the hands of skilled people who know how to analyze the data so that they and the people around them can make better predictions and better decisions. So yes, having the data is very important, but having people who know how to work with data to make better decisions, predictions, analysis, and so on, whether it's in strategic planning for the business, whether it's in legal decisions, and so on, is very, very important. And neither the data nor the AI algorithm is going to make the decision any more than when you're searching for information, the Google search does it by itself. I'm the one who says, find me this or that, find me the head of the Federal Reserve that first went fishing in Jackson Hole, and that's why the Fed meets in Jackson Hole. I asked that, and then I got data. So skills is really, really important. And companies have to make sure that they are upskilling their employees to be able to work in this environment.
Lizanne, just one more thought. So all previous points well taken. I would say in addition, the U.S. has benefited, I think, both from the federal approach that we use with letting states like California go forward with legislation and experiment at the state level before adopting federal legislation, but also using a bit of a go slow approach, the opposite of the approach that the Europeans have taken, where they've regulated proactively. It hasn't been mentioned, I think, yet, but people should be aware that EU now has an AI Act. It's called the EU AI Act. It went into effect during the summer. I want to say probably August, if I remember right. And it gradually then becomes it goes into enforcement over the next year. There's been a lot of concern over the EU AI Act, that it's overly prescriptive, discouraging of innovation, encouraging European entrepreneurs and innovators like the folks that Irving's mentioning to move their activities to the US to avoid overregulation in Europe. There's been a big backlash from some big reputable American companies that have said, we're not going to play, we're out. We're not going to let Europeans benefit from our AI. So I think the go slow approach on regulation that the US has used at the federal level is my view, probably the right one, and correlates with the point we all made at the beginning of this hour, which is that, look, AI is a tool. It's probably not going to take over the world anytime soon, and we shouldn't panic about regulating it any more than we regulate any other tool.
Yeah, if I may add, one way that I've seen this described, Dave, is that in the US, we encourage experimentation in the marketplace. And to do that, you may be taking some risks, and then if you find something doesn't work or you should do that, you apologize, you say, I'm sorry, you try to correct it. The EC, the European Union, says, no, don't experiment in the marketplace until you are sure it's going to work. And unfortunately, that may mean that you will not get there for a long time. So I think I clearly, being a person here in the US, I love the experimentation in the marketplace approach compared to make sure nothing bad happens.
So, Lizanne, if I may just add briefly to that, I agree with Dave and Irving that, like, in general, over time, the US approach has been lighter touch to some of these new areas. That's certainly true on privacy and data security. It's certainly true now on AI. And I agree with them as a kind of normative matter that that's better, right? Because people can experiment and we can permit innovation. I will say that is not the mentality of US regulators today. That's point number one. And point number two, I don't think that's the view reflected in the recent California bills, right? Because part of what they're doing, what they're mandating in these bills is specifically risk anticipation and mitigation. They want you, before you introduce products to market, to be doing that testing, to worry about these risks. I don't know that that's the right path, but I do think that's part of the idea reflected in the legislation. So it will be interesting to see whether we are able to keep moving forward on the light touch approach that we've taken.
And Bill, I'd ask you, we've had a question from the audience, you know, the lighter touch and the patchwork approach. How does that increase the risk environment if it does? And what do you think companies ought to be doing in that regard?
So I mean, I think it comes down to, and it's the idea both Dave and Irving touched on, but when do you have valuable data to begin with? If you have it, are you able to utilize it in a manner most effectively to, in effect, take advantage of it in the ways you'd like to? But if you are, the more success you have and the more visible that success is, let's say in the US model, that you've got the data, you know how to utilize it well, meaning for business purposes, and you have the latitude to experiment in the way that you want to experiment. What that tells me is just, and again, the rest of the panel is so expert on AI. Of course, my world is risks and threats, but the more exposure, the more success you have, just means the bullseye on your back is getting larger and larger and larger. And so the more public you are with your successes, just greatly increases your risk profile, versus if everything you're doing is behind the scenes and you get to perfect before it comes to market, in many ways, not as many threat actors even know about what you're doing. The more public you are, absolutely they know what you're doing, and you're going to have more people targeting you.
Great. Thanks. We're about at time. And so I want to offer our panelists an opportunity for any closing thoughts. And I'll take the opportunity to say thank you very much to each of you for joining us, and to our audience for tuning in and posing questions in what I thought was a really interesting discussion. All right, with that, I think we'll wrap it up. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Lizanne.
Thank you, Lizanne.
Thank you.